In this edition, we've got some fantastic layouts to share with you, including some that have been in operation for decades. As for prototypes, we'll take you to some absolutely amazing railroad destinations and explore great equipment from the past and present. And of course, we all strive to add realism and detail to our layouts. So we'll share some secrets and techniques that will help you make your operation look more authentic. And when you see this graphic, pay attention because it tells you the name of a computer file stored on this DVD, including additional details and techniques for creating and improving your layout. Let's get rolling as we bring the action, power, and creativity of model railroading to life in the Dream, Plan, Build video series.
Welcome to Ralph Plachter's basement, or should we say, welcome to Ralph's own little world. This model HO layout takes up 90% of his basement, and you've got to think the remaining 10% might go pretty soon. My, how things have grown. 30 years ago, Ralph picked up a little train set for his kids, a few sections of track on top of some plywood, nothing major. Well, those boys kind of lost interest, but the train bug had bitten Ralph, and he fell victim to that most pleasurable affliction called model railroading. Ralph stepped in and said, "Kids, watch how it's done."
I added some switches and a passing siding, and I found out it was not all that easy to wire it up, and it was kind of a challenge. So after I mastered that first little step, I was hungry for more, and it just snowballed. And all of a sudden I had a whole 4x8 sheet full of track, and I was hooked, and it went from there.
3 decades later, you have an empire that Ralph Plachter calls the Midwest Lines. It runs from northwest Kansas to Colorado, just east of the Rockies. 550 feet of track and a whopping 108 turnouts or switches. 150 freight cars and 20 operating locomotives. On a scale of 1 to 10 here, folks, we're talking about an 11.
Well, I never worried about it getting too big. I was never thinking about that. I always worried whether I would finish it. But it was all worth it, because if you consider how many fathers have a chance to share a hobby with their sons, that made it all worthwhile.
Oh, by the way, son Rick, that little boy who many years ago lost interest in his train set, has gained it back. Probably not that hard to do when you see your dad building the equivalent of the Taj Mahal in your basement.
I don't really remember why I lost interest in the beginning, but as I watched the layout grow over the years, I realized that I liked what I saw, and I again wanted to participate. Well, I have a lot of fun sharing this hobby with my father, because we both have a great love for this hobby, and he enjoys the technical aspects of the hobby, such as track work, the electrical wiring and such. And I've always had an eye for modeling the creative visual aspect of it.
I enjoyed building from the ground up. I start with the bench work, the track work. I like electrical work, electronics, and I also like some structures. The scenery is not my forte, but that's where my son comes in. He is great at that.
Now this father and son team works side by side and hand in hand. The Midwest Line runs east to west through the gorgeous countryside and 7 towns. You see everything from agriculture to industry, set between the towns that make up America.
We call it the Midwest Lines because the equipment, the railroads that we're running are running in the Midwest. Mine being Union Pacific, and my son likes Rock Island and Burlington, and those 3 railroads all run in the Midwest. As in our case, on the same trackage. That's why we call it the Midwest Lines. I picked this time period because of the equipment that was running at those times. We like first generation diesels, and sometimes it allows us to run a steam engine or 2, and we like the paint schemes of the past. That's why we picked this period of 1960, 1965.
This model railroad also gives a great deal of pleasure to the many friends who come over every week. a digital command control system complements work assignments from the computer-generated work menu. The new age meets old friends.
Well, I like to share my hobby with other friends. The more people that come here and operate, the more the layout comes alive, and the more fun it is to run it.
For Ralph Proctor, this little train has delivered the goods. Good friends, good times, and good memories.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about installing digital command control decoders in your locomotives. The power on a model railroad really has two functions. One is to supply the energy that moves the trains, operates the accessories, things like that. The other is to control the trains as accessories. On a DC layout, the traditional power pack, you vary the speed by varying the voltage. Higher voltage in the tracks, faster train. Lower voltage, slower train. You vary the direction by changing the polarity here. DC has some advantages. It's very simple on a small layout, 2 wires to the track, but it also has some disadvantages. You can't control more than one train on a track. If you do wish to do that, you have to divide the rails into blocks, run multiple wires, use some switches, things like that. Digital control, on the other hand, has constant power to the tracks, between 12 and 18 volts, depending on how you have your system set. And then it pulses that power, kind of like Morse code, to tell the trains what to do. Each train has a different name or address. Each train has a decoder inside it. That decoder listens for its address, sort of like your dog listening for its name. And then when it hears its name, it will do what you tell it to do. If it doesn't hear its name, it doesn't change whatever it's doing at the time, whether that be going down the track or sitting in the yard. The advantage here is that you can run more than one train, you can run dozens of trains actually, on a single track without having to divide the track electrically. Disadvantage for some people is you have to install the decoder in your locomotive. There are 3 basic types of decoder installations. My favorite is the factory installation. The factory puts it in, I don't have to do it. But that's not possible for every locomotive, especially if you have some older locomotives that you've enjoyed for years. You want to convert them, you need to do something else. The second kind of installation is the plug-in installation. This Athearn RS3 here is an example of a locomotive that's already prepared for that type of installation. The factory has installed a circuit board that has a connector here. All you'll do with this locomotive is remove the factory jumper board, take a DCC decoder, and slide that into place. We just converted this locomotive to digital command control. One of the most frequent questions we get at the magazine is how do you convert an older Athearn diesel locomotive to digital command control? This is the classic Athearn drive, motor in the middle, flywheels, gears on either end, and electrically there are these 2 pieces that come up from the trucks, and this bar carries the power from one rail to the locomotive. Now that's all pretty straightforward. The challenge comes in finding the other connection to the motor. These motors are actually grounded to the frame through this clip that's on the bottom side. For DCC to function correctly, the motor cannot be grounded to the frame. The 2 leads to the motor have to go back to the decoder, and then the decoder itself is grounded to the frame or has wires going to each rail. The challenge then is how do you isolate the motor from the frame electrically when you have this bracket on the bottom that has the prongs on it. Simplest thing I've found to do is to hold the motor together or even tape it and then pop the 2 brackets off. There are little tabs here that let you do that with a screwdriver. Now be careful when you do that. The springs that hold the brushes in place and the brushes themselves may come out. Make sure those are back in place and then take the bracket that was on the bottom of the motor, put it on the top of the motor, take the bracket that's on the top of the motor that, as you see, has no prongs on it, and put it on the bottom side of the motor. Then, when you put your motor back in the frame, you'll actually have the brackets looking like that, and the motor will be isolated from the frame. Now, if you're an extra safe guy, belt and suspenders sort of guy, you can take your pliers and use those to flatten the bracket a little bit. You can also put some tape in between the motor and the frame if you'd like to. It's not absolutely necessary, but again, a little extra security. This locomotive is an example of one that I've converted to DCC using that method. I used a board like this. I used tape to hold it to the top of the motor. Then I hooked wires from its motor terminals to each of the brackets on the motor. Hooked other wires from these terminals to the power connections on the trucks. And finally, these two red wires, one from each end of the board, go to two different spots on the frame of the locomotive. I used the headlight bracket, and I also used the bracket that the coupler attaches to. Soldered it to this one, used a screw terminal on this one, so the ground is secure. Once in a while, you'll run into a locomotive that either isn't pre-wired, like the Atherton locomotive we just looked at, or else it's wired for DCC in a way where it just seems like you're better off starting over. This lifelike RDC is an example of that. Nice locomotive, runs well, but the circuit board that it comes with has these little pads where you would attach wires for a decoder. It also has some traces on the board that you need to cut through, including one that's right between two other traces. After looking at it, I thought, you know what, I'm better off just starting from scratch. This locomotive is pretty typical. The wires are held to the board with small black plastic clips. You can take your needle nose pliers and remove those. Once you've removed the clips that hold each of the wires on, then you'll also take your screwdriver and remove the small screws that hold the board in place. Before you pull the wires from the board, however, it's important to make sure you know which one is which. This locomotive is really nice. Lifelike labeled the board so that it says left power number 1, front light number 1, front light number 2, right power number 1, motor number 1, or motor number 2, etc. Once you've taken the board out, frequently you'll find that one of the wires isn't long enough to reach the spot where you're going to place your new decoder. On the RDC, the power wires coming up from the rear truck wouldn't make it to the middle of the locomotive. Took some number 22 wire, used my wire strippers to strip the ends, and then I'll solder this piece of wire in place to extend these wires from the rear truck. I like to tin the ends of the wires before I solder. Put the iron on, wait for the wire to get hot. Once it does, the solder melts onto the wire. It's good to have a little bit of a mechanical connection between your wires if you can. That helps hold them in place while you solder the joint. Also gives the joint a little bit of strength after it's soldered. I usually use this pair of tweezers in a stand to hold one of the wires in place because, well, I need one hand for the iron, one hand for the solder, and that's all the hands I have. Once you've completed soldering your wires, don't forget to insulate them. Once you have all your wires extended to the proper length, it's time to install the decoder. The decoder I'm using for this installation is from Train Control Systems. I chose it because it has outputs at 1.5 volts as well as at track voltage. And on some locomotives, the light bulbs that come in from the factory are 1.5 volt bulbs. If you give them full track voltage, 12 to 18 volts, they'll burn out. You can use resistors to lower the voltage to the bulbs, but with this decoder, you don't even need to do that because it's already prepared for it. Usually the easiest way to hold the decoder in place is with double-sided foam tape. Not only will the foam tape hold your decoder in place, but it will insulate it electrically from any other connections on the locomotive, making sure that you don't have any short circuits. When you attach the wire to the circuit board, first you take the wire up through the hole in the board, then take your hot iron, place it on the pad, wait a few seconds, then you touch your solder to it. Now you have a nice solid joint with the solder flowed smoothly across the pad. Occasionally a wire will slip out of place while you're soldering it to the pad. Now you have a pad with solder on it, holes clogged with solder. What do? It's pretty simple actually. Take some desoldering braid, which is a braid of copper mesh. Heat the pad up again with your iron. Wipe the braid across the pad. It draws the solder up into it, and you have a fresh pad, clean, ready to start. And here's what you'll have when you're done. The power wires from the trucks to the outer terminals, the wires to the motor on the side terminals, power feed to the lights here, the grounds from the lights there. If you look over on the track there is a locomotive that I did last weekend, and there you go.
If you've never seen a garden railroad, take a look at one of the best. When you mix the technical appeal of an impressive layout with the natural beauty of a well-manicured setting, you end up with an environment that looks like a miniature version of reality. The Coldwater Canyon Railroad is the result of years of hard work by Charlie and Pam Allen. They've turned a big chunk of their front yard into what's become a 40 by 80-foot eye-popping tourist attraction and neighborhood wonderland. The weather in Los Altos, California is usually the cooperative partner you need for a creation like this. But it also presents a few added challenges that the basement modeler doesn't encounter.
Some of the challenges for an outdoor layout are that you have to build for the weather. You put something down on in an indoor layout, it stays put. The scene remains exactly the same. The scene is constantly changing on an outdoor layout. The buildings have to be weatherproofed, or you'll lose them in a year or so. Ran across one where I ended up with termites in the building and had to replace some of the planks in the building. We have an occasional animal that comes through here, and they can raise havoc in a very short time or leave a deposit which is unwanted, that sort of thing. This was an evolutionary process, but it's the Sierra Nevada foothills. It's circa 1925, 2025 thereabouts. It's supposedly midsummer, somewhere around the 4th of July. The reason for the layout, it's a logging operation. It's a small town. The county fair is in full progress. The circus is in town, and it's a holiday, so there's a minimum amount of work being done at the mill. And it's sort of reflects to a simpler time than we live in today.
It's the obvious three-dimensional appeal that pulls you in. There are bridges and trestles. There are rivers and ponds. The railroad can handle up to 5 trains at once, and those trains roll up, down, in, out, and everywhere. There are detailed scenes strategically placed throughout, and at times they'll include whatever they want. The structures are kit-built, kit-bashed, and scratch-built. Check out the weathered sawmill. It's the railroad's biggest customer. The slash burner, used to burn unwanted sawdust, is functional as well. It features a small charcoal fire which forces the smoke through the top screen, which, by the way, is nothing but an old kitchen strainer minus the handle. More than just complimentary, the scenery here is an integral part of this setup.
We scraped off the lawn. We've brought in about 30 cubic yards of planter mix. Used planter mix instead of topsoil in that wherever we planted a tree, a shrub, or a plant of any sort, it was going to grow. Also, there are much less incidence of weeds that way. Also brought in about 20 tons of rock for landscaping. I think the main thrust of trying to keep things looking somewhat real is to keep it into scale. You'll notice that most of the leaves on the shrubs are quite small. The chamacypris and the cryptomeria for the pine trees have very, very tiny needles on them. Pixie ivy for the vineyard.
Like every good layout, it makes you feel like a part of the scenery. As you might imagine, this place is a neighborhood favorite.
It's brought the kids together, it's brought the parents together. We've had parties out here on holidays. They sit in the driveway on blankets and they just have a good time.
There's virtually no planning, it's just what happened. If you like to track there, that's where it went. Keep it as simple as possible and have a good time. Don't get bogged down in detail. We are looking for an illusion, and I think we've captured it.
The track underneath the train is kind of like the heel on the bottom of an expensive shoe. It's certainly not the first thing you notice, but it has everything to do with how well the shoe works. Track maintenance is an ongoing and never-ending job. A lot of it depends on where the track is located, climatic and geographic conditions, and how much the track gets used. Track is replaced, ties are replaced, spikes are replaced, and so are all the related parts. The Nordco Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin is one of the few companies in the world that make a complete line of track maintenance equipment.
Nordco is the oldest manufacturer of track maintenance equipment in North America, having been in this business since 1926. And they got into the business recognizing that there was nobody in North America manufacturing machines that could maintain railroad track. And then during the years we started out with spike pullers, tie adzers, ballast cleaning equipment we were into, tire replacers, we were into that. We were into any number of types of equipment, and right now we manufacture machines primarily concerned with fasteners. And we're located in Milwaukee. We started in Milwaukee in 1926, and we're still in Milwaukee in the same location.
Computers are used daily in the design of our equipment, simply from the standpoint of speed and also to produce a quality piece of equipment. We found that with that type of an aid, we're able to produce equipment faster and make it a lot more productive for our customers. Computers today not only help us design the equipment, but they're an integral part of the way the machine operates. This machine, for example, we have a computer which operates the entire machine, and it will make the machine operate automatically. The operator sits in the chair and lets the machine do its functions. It'll put spikes in automatically, travel from tie to tie automatically. The only thing the operator is concerned with is putting material into the machine.
Today we've got on the test track, we've got a grabber, which is a spike puller. The spike puller is used at the start of a gang to pull the spikes out of the old ties or off of the old rail, so they can either remove the old rail or remove the old ties. We also today have a Model C hammer, which is a spike driving machine, and that's used at the end of the gang to either respike the new ties or respike the new rail.
Watching track replacement is fascinating. Here, near Waukegan, Illinois, the Union Pacific is replacing jointed rail with rail that is basically one long piece that is welded together.
First step in this operation is to remove the anchors. In this case, it is being done by men using sledgehammers. This frees the rail to be removed. The second step is a crane takes the new rail from the side of the track and moves it to the center, in between the two existing rails. Next operation is a spike puller. The spikes are pulled using two machines in this operation. After the spikes are pulled, men come along and pick up and retrieve the excess spikes for later collection. Next, a couple of bolt machines, which are basically wrenches, turn loose the bolts at the joint bars. After this operation is done, the former spike holes are filled with a chemical plugging compound. After the holes are filled, speed swing cranes with magnets remove the old rail, the plates, spikes and material, they move them off to the side. Once the old rail and plates are out of the way, a machine called a cribber adzer comes along, and it removes the ballast away from the ties and cuts the tie plate seat with an adzing head. This is very similar to a planer, and you'll notice a device similar to that used in sawmills to remove the excess dust and debris. Once the adzing and ballast are cleared away, new tie plates are laid down using a machine that takes the plates from the side of the rail up through the machine and lays them on the ties. Men will align and make sure that the plates are properly positioned prior to inserting the new rail using a crane. Once the crane sets the rail into place, machines come along and gauge the track and spike it down. Machines automatically set the gauge to 56.5 inches, and the operator spikes about approximately every third tie. Now this sets the rail in so that it's fixed, but it still needs to be set for to control expansion. The next machine would be a vibrator and a heater combination. What this does is it allows the rail to come up to what would normally be, for whatever region it is, the hottest temperature. Once rail temperature is set, the rail is then clipped or anchored using anchor machines. This prevents the rail from moving any further. Once the anchors are on, the rail is then once again spiked back up and the operation is complete.
The machinery now eliminates a lot of the labor required to work on the track. Track work is hard, dangerous work, and it's hard getting people to want to do this type of work, but you also have to increase the productivity to the point now that labor, regardless of how much labor you put on the track, isn't going to get the productivity you need. So the new machinery now is automated. Some of it's operated by computer. Others of it is just electronics over hydraulics to make the machine as fast as possible. They're generally a lot larger. They're more powerful. And they can change where a Gandy could maybe do a tie every couple of minutes. The new machines now can change out 6 ties a minute.
Today we're going to talk about laying flex track on a model railroad. This is the next step up for many model railroaders from the sectional track that most of us get started with, building those small 4x8 layouts and that kind of thing. The beauty of flex track is that you can bend it any which way you want to, and so you're not restricted to the curve sizes that come with sectional track. Now if we look at this flex track, this is HO flex track made by Atlas Model Railroad Company, very typical of what's out there. We can see that on one side, the bottom side here of the tie strip, the plastic is cast in a solid piece. If we look at the top, we can see that there are spaces between every second tie. Generally, we want to make the rail joints in the flexible track on a straight section. It's just a lot easier to do. It also makes a better connection. You want as few joints as possible in the curve because each joint introduces the opportunity for a derailment or a little kink or a little bit of a problem. And we'll just run a small bead down the middle right along the center line for the cork road bed. We don't need very much, and in fact we don't want to have too much because you don't want the adhesive to work up between the ties. Well, there's nothing to this. We're going to lay this piece on this curved section. Let's look at what we have so far. You can see that the rail here is sticking out about 1/4 inch further than the other rail. To fix this problem, we'll use a pair of rail nippers. This is a very important tool for model railroaders. If you're going to be laying much track at all, that you have yourself a good pair of rail nippers. They're a very good investment. Once you bought them, use them only to cut rail. Don't use them to be cutting other things. All right. Anytime you want to cut rail, get the plastic out of the way first so that you just make a clean cut on the rail. In order to be able to slide our rail joiner on here, we need to get rid of a couple of these ties. And the way I do that is to take an X-Acto knife, cut up through the bottom of the tie strip like this, and then we'll just take a hold of these last 2 ties and pull them off. This rail slid a little bit on us, so we'll just have to shove it back. And we want to take a small file, and we'll just dress these cut edges a little bit. The bottom part's called the base. We want to file that along that surface, along the other surface, top of the base, so that we won't have any problem sliding the rail joiner on. There, now we have finished dressing the end of that rail, and we're ready to slip on a rail joiner so that we can attach the next piece of rail. Well, now we're ready to do the adjoining piece of track. We'll need to put down some of our adhesive again. If we've got our adhesive in place, we'll get these started, get the ends started in the rail joiners, and then we'll take our pliers, and we don't want to grip the joiner itself. We want to grip outside of it and use the pliers as a tool to shove the joiners on. So those are the basics of working with flexible track. Remember, flexible track allows you to build curves in any radius that you want, gives you fewer rail joints. Fewer rail joints means fewer derailments. I hope you'll enjoy working with flexible track, and I know it can help you build a better layout.
The lumber company railroads of the Sierra Nevada were tough workhorses, just like the men who earned a living there. Narrow-gauge logging railroads that rolled through the foothills of the Sierra, not far from Yosemite National Park. They brought the men in and the logs out round the clock during logging season. One of the best was the West Side Lumber Company. Its 72 miles of track and the years of history are accurately replicated in a small 10-foot by 10-foot layout in the San Jose, California home of Steve Anderson. He models the late 1950s.
I chose the West Side because it allows me to model two favorite things: the high Sierras with all the tall trees and the mostly geared locomotives that the West Side ran.
Steve's layout is not the giant basement layout he once dreamed about. It's just a small layout in an upstairs bedroom in his house. It's the narrow gauge that allows Steve to put so much into such a little space.
Narrow gauge is just a medium. It's no different than modeling standard gauge, except that the railroad I am interested in happened to be narrow gauge. SN3 is a scale I settled on after experimenting with HON3 and ON3. HON3 being difficult to run reliably, and ON3 being so large that you need a basement to get anything done. Logging railroads are interesting to model. The equipment is different because it was mostly home built, and the locomotives all have a certain character to them. It's not a big time operation, so you don't need acres of real estate to model it effectively.
Steve's not just a modeler, he's a craftsman. It's such a realistic looking layout because Steve Anderson did such a great job putting it together. He built it in small sections. Each one is electrically independent, so it's unpluggable and movable. Most of the structures are scratch built. The buildings with interiors are built board by board with complete framing, including studs and rafters. On the other buildings, scale lumber was simply glued to the sheet styrene, which was used for the roof and the walls. Those are beautiful brass models of the geared Shea and Heisler engines that the West Side used. You'll notice that the rolling stock is only lightly weathered. Steve says that's accurate as well, because on the prototypes, the equipment was well maintained.
Logging railroads existed off of moving timber out of the woods, and light weathering is essential. Basically, the winter months, when the snow was deep in the woods, prevented you from bringing the timber out. This is especially true later in the logging years, as everything was done by trucks. And not only would you have to wait for the snow to melt for the railroad, but you'd also have to wait for the dirt to dry for the diesel trucks to drive through it. During these months of inoperation, the railroad rebuilt much of their equipment. Most of their equipment was wood, and they basically would burn the car, salvage the metal parts, and then put them onto new timber.
As far as the scenery is concerned, the technique is fairly simple. Blue extruded foam is the base for hydrocal. Commercial rock castings were not stained, but instead painted with artist acrylic paints. And if some of the ground cover looks like the real thing, that's because it is.
Several visits for logging conventions and train rides placed me within close proximity of the west side, so I just gathered up dirt and decided to experiment with it. It's very easy to work with, and it captures the color perfectly.
So, if you ever thought you needed a giant house and a lot of space in order to build a first-class layout, think again. Steve Anderson is proof positive that bigger is not always better.
We're going to start our project this morning by building the basic framework for the main part of the layout. And this will be a 4 by 8 foot main section. Now the first thing we need to do is cut the cross pieces. Now the next step that we're going to do is mark the locations of the cross pieces along the long piece of wood. So we take, measure down and put a mark down, and then we can measure from the end to the next mark. We use some carpenter's glue, and we can take the nails, and the easiest way is to start it while they're in the flat plane laying across the benches here. And if we start them about an inch in from each edge, then we're all set. And we just set it on the glue. Make sure everything is centered from edge to edge, and then drive the nails in. Check and make sure that the board hasn't twisted. This one was just a little bit. And we can put the next set of nails. And now we just turn it over. Okay, the next step is going to be to put the plywood top on. And we need to do that before the glue joints harden, or this will be so solid we won't be able to move it to square things up. As a sheet of plywood has square corners on it, and that will square the whole layout up. By doing the one long edge first, the wood is flexible enough that we can lift it up to get the glue in on the other edges here. So I can come in and apply the bead of glue all along this strip, and then just use a couple of clamps to pull it down and hold it in place while I nail it down. Okay, the next step is going to be to nail the top to the cross pieces. So this is where those extra lines on the outside come in, because these are then used to line up a straight edge on each side, and then draw the line across. Okay, to take the belly out of the middle of the layout, I'm just going to run a bead of glue down underneath each one of the cross pieces. And then when we nail it down, that'll really get a hold of everything and hold it in place. Now that we have our tabletop finished, the next step is to make legs to support the entire layout. So for this step, we're going to use 2 pieces of the 1/2 inch by 3 inch plywood, put them together at a 90-degree angle. And then inside of that, we're going to put a 2 by 2 filler block at one end. So we apply a bead of glue in here. and tack the 2x2 into the corner. Each leveling foot consists of two parts. There's a bushing that's going to fit in the end of the leg, and then a foot with a screw on it. And that way the layout can be adjusted to any kind of a floor. We're going to mount the brace, in this case 18 inches up from the floor. We picked the 18-inch point because that's just about midway in the leg, and it gives us the most strength so that the layout won't wobble from side to side if we bump it. And the nuts have a nylon insert in them to help them not work loose with time. Now the next step with the legs is to clamp them back to back so that the two top ends of the legs are together. Because we're going to drill through both of them to put mounting bolts into the layout later on. But by drilling them at the same time like this, we wind up with interchangeable legs. So if you ever move the layout to a show or something like that, the legs are interchangeable and they'll work on either end of the layout. To install the leg assembly, we set it in alongside of the cross brace that it's going to be mounted on, slide it all the way to one side, and then measure the distance in here. And half of this distance is what we want on each end. So I have to come up here halfway, and then we can clamp the legs in place and drill the two holes that'll be bolting them on. You can start to see how much this cross brace gives it a strength so it doesn't move side to side. But end to end it's still going to be shaky. So the last step we'll do is add a couple of X braces on each side, which will give it the stability for end-to-end movement. And the way we do that is start out with a piece of lath wood here and put a bolt through, drill a hole about an inch from the end of it. We put a hole in the middle of the leg 32 inches from the bottom and put this bolt through the hole. Then we can come up here, put a mark that's a foot from the top of the layout, and we know just about how long these pieces have to be. So what I'm going to do is mark an approximate center line here so I know where that point will be on this leg. Now to make sure that everything's going to fit, we're going to reverse it. I already have a hole drilled for the top end over here, and we do the same thing on this side. And then we know from this hole that's about where the brace will be when we're all done. So what we'll do now is drill the holes in both ends of them, cut the braces all to length, and then we'll drill the upper hole in all the legs. Now at this point, if we want things to look a little nicer, put the brace behind the leg and then put the bolt in. With all the pieces in place, it is really amazing how strong this type of construction is.
When you were a kid, what did you want more than anything? Steve Baldwin wanted a layout with the coolest trains and accessories.
I remember it was Christmas Eve of 1955, and I was 5 years old, and I heard the sounds of my father and one of the neighbors helping him in the garage building the first train layout. That was very exciting for me, and sure enough, there was a layout waiting for me on the floor on Christmas morning, figure 8 with my first train set. As a matter of fact, I still have some of those same trains today, but that's another story.
Like a lot of us, Steve got interested in a lot of other stuff, and the trains got mothballed. Fortunately, his parents didn't add his classic collection to any garage sales.
I remember specifically it was 1981, and I had been living out of town for a long time and decided to go to visit my parents and went down to look for something in the basement one day. Maybe we were getting ready to make some homemade ice cream, and I was looking for the old freezer or something that we had when I was a little boy. And there were a couple of A&P grocery boxes lying way back in the basement. And I opened up the tops of them, and there were my trains. There were my same trains I hadn't seen in, you know, who knows, nearly 20 years. It was quite amazing, and the feeling that came back, you know, of holding those for the first time, and the smell of the smokestacks and the engines, you know, I remembered that smell, and the smell of the oil in the trains. It was very, very familiar to me. And all these mental images started coming back of what it was like to play with those trains.
Finding his old friends added coal to the fire of his interest in trains. What you see here is a dream come true, but also one that's still being dreamt.
I hope it's not done. That would be very depressing if it were. Every day I look for other items to add, whether it be more people. There are probably about 200 metal figures, people, cats, dogs, squirrels, crows. There are crows over there in the cornfield that I've added to it, and I keep looking for those, for vehicles, for more billboards, and of course trains. The trains get changed out periodically as well.
He decided on new Lionel trains with O-gauge straight and O72 curves, and he relied on his own imagination and ingenuity.
That's one thing I'm very proud of, and I didn't do it necessarily to impress someone, but just for personal satisfaction. I perhaps learned something about myself in the process, and that is a bit of a creative side that I didn't know that I had. It started out with constructing 24 individual sawhorses, which are underneath, and then there are different layers of plywood that are on top of that. And then I started building the various landforms that create the mountains and the hillsides and the rocky cliffs and things like that.
The key to the realism in this layout is looking at real life.
Did a lot of driving around, and I looked at actual train yards, classification yards, and places where trains were stored and switched and assembled and things like that, and looked at how the spacing of the tracks and how they switched from one place to another and the kinds of structures that were there. And that gave me a lot of ideas. I even took photographs and brought them back, and so a lot of the things that you see are really modeled after real life.
The trains running along this track are a combination of new and Steve's old models from when he was a kid. The trains run through towns filled with prized Plasticville structures, including more than 20,000 scale square feet of building space.
As I started going to train shows, I found that I could get some of these original Plasticville pieces. And the one that I found the first time was the factory. There's a factory over there with smokestacks and a loading dock. And that is exactly like one I had. And so I said, well, goodness, I can just marry this together. And I'd seen some photographs in some of the collector magazines of Plasticville and Lionel together. And I said, well, that just is very, very consistent with the look from the mid-1950s. So that's what I was trying to do.
None of us can ever be a kid again. But, like Steve, some of us are lucky enough to have a place like this where we can come, sit, and remember a time when these trains were all we wanted and everything seemed possible.
So you found an old train in your attic, and you're wondering what to do with it. Maybe it belonged to your father or your grandfather or your Uncle Charlie or someone else in the relation, and now it's yours. Well, you have basically three options, I guess. One would be to try to clean it up and get it to run and run it around the Christmas tree next season. Or you could sell it, maybe make a few dollars. Or I guess you could put it back in the attic. Let's assume you want to run it. Well, first of all, you're going to have to inspect the parts, inspect the pieces to see that everything is there, that nothing is bent or broken, and then you might want to clean them. Let's take a look at some of these, shall we? This one seems to be in pretty good shape, and perhaps a little work with a common paintbrush will get some of the surface dust off the thing. If you're not satisfied with that, you can use some other kind of product. You can use Pledge or WD-40 or any other kind of product that will get the more ground in dirt off of the model. Let's deal with this locomotive, get the dust off of it, and if we're not really happy with the way it looks, we might use a little Pledge. I like to use old t-shirts for this project because their fabric is just about right. So spray a little Pledge on the t-shirt and rub it on the engine. Oh, look at it shine. That will get the ground in dirt and the dust very, very easily. The points to lubricate on a locomotive, and I have some model oil here. You can use anything. Good old 3-in-1 has been used for generations. We want to lubricate the driver axles and the motor shaft. We're ready to test run the locomotive. Now we've already hooked up a transformer to the track. You see the two wires here going to the lock-on, which is a wonderful device. All you do is snap it in place and the electricity gets into the track. You might want to look at the transformer cord first, because quite often over the years these rubber electrical cords become very, very brittle. This one's in good shape, so it's ready to plug in. Before you actually put the train on the track, it's a good idea to clean the track. Now for this you would need a good old Scotch-Brite pad. Buy them at any grocery store. And don't ever use steel wool on toy train tracks, because many of the locomotives have magnetic attraction. They called it magnetraction. And any crumbs left by the steel wool are bound to wind up in your motor, and you don't need that. So the good old plastic Scotch-Brite pad. Clean the track, rub it briskly with the Scotch-Brite pad until the surface shines. Then you're all set to go. And now for the moment of truth. Let's put it on the track. The little engine that could, and see if it still can. What do you know? It runs like a champ. If you decide you want to sell the train, really the first thing you have to do is identify it. Who made it, and what is the model or the catalog number of each piece. This is very important to collectors. The numbers are either on the side or on the bottom of the model. Those are the only places you have to look. One of the most important considerations in the old toy train world is condition. They say in real estate it's location, location. In toy trains it's condition, condition. Old pieces that, like this one, have a lot of rust on them probably won't sell for much. And that's why we say clean up your train, make it look as presentable and honestly presentable as possible. Don't touch it up, just clean it up. Now, where would you go to find a buyer? Well, the most obvious place is newspaper ads. They're still good. The classifieds work very well. put an ad in, tell them what you have, you know the manufacturer and the model number, and see what develops. Or look for ads from collectors. Some of them run Trains Wanted ads regularly in the local papers. Or you could go down to the hobby shop, your local hobby shop, talk to the people there. Maybe they know someone who'd be interested in your train. Or if you're so inclined to go on the internet, there are these auction sites, eBay being perhaps the best known, where you can put your train on auction and see what develops. You will probably do better if you sell your train directly to a collector who wants it, rather than to a dealer who will give you less money because he has to resell it to someone. And then, of course, the third option is put it back in the attic. I don't think we'll get too many takers on that, because once a toy train is out of the box and in someone's hands, it seems to take on a life all its own. After all, these things were made to run, to play with, and to bring joy, which they continue to do in every generation.
Joshua Lionel Cohen, born in 1877, grew up in Manhattan, the eighth of 9 children. An intelligent, curious, and extroverted boy, he often took apart his sister's dolls in order to see how they worked. As an adult, Cohen took a job at the Acme Electric Lamp Company. At this small electrical shop, he would develop the skills that would eventually enable him to launch his own business. On September 5, 1900, Cohen and a colleague from Acme, Harry C. Grant, filed to conduct business in New York. The firm would engage in the manufacturing of electrical novelties and would be known as the Lionel Manufacturing Company.
He came up with the idea of taking his small motor and using it to power a crude-looking railroad car on a small loop of track. And he took that motor and he attached it to the underside of what was really a little box on wheels, devised a loop of track that was 2 7/8 inches between the rails. This was not a gauge that was being used elsewhere in the United States or in Europe.
Cohen sold his first railroad car not as a toy, but to a shopkeeper to attract attention to his store windows. It sold for $4, nearly half a week's wages for most people in 1900. Pretty soon the shopkeeper came back for another. Turned out he didn't use it in his window, he had sold it as a toy for the general public.
Lionel now had its own product. It was determined to establish its own niche in a rapidly expanding toy train industry. By the end of 1902, sales had reached $22,000. By the end of the 1900s, they had nearly tripled. Cohen wanted to surpass Ives Manufacturing, which was the leading producer of toy trains in the United States. To do that, he had to come up with a more extensive line of trains. He began doing this in 1906 when he introduced a line of stamped metal trains that was built to a gauge of 2 1/8 inches between the rails. No one else in the world was doing this, not in the United States, not in Europe, and yet he called it standard gauge, a very bold assertion, yet very quickly this did become the standard among electric train producers.
A marketing genius, Cohen came up with a line of accessories and sold each for $1.50. At $6 per set, plus $1.20 for batteries, this toy represented a huge piece of the household budget in 1902.
Cohen quickly learned 2 very valuable lessons from his domestic and foreign competitors. The first was to establish a complete line of trains. He learned this from Marklin and other German competitors. And that line would include trains, rolling stock, and accessories. And this would give children the opportunity over time to acquire more and build their own little empire, their own little network of trains at home. The other thing he learned, which was important, was from Ives Manufacturing, and that is the importance of having an annual catalog, a wish book, in which children could look and see what was available and dream all year of what they would ask for their birthday or for the holidays. In doing this, They would see what they wanted for their empire and then have the toys there that they could indeed get. And the idea was that this could hook them into the hobby for 3-4 years of their lives.
From 1910 to 1920, Lionel sales grew 15 times. At the time, Lionel employed 700 workers. Sales kept increasing, and the company was a year-round success, not just a Christmas-only toy for boys. In 1931, Lionel had its first losing year. The Depression had hit, and no one had extra money for luxuries like toy trains. It's been said that Mickey Mouse himself saved the company from going under. Lionel produced a handcar with Mickey's likeness for just $1.
In 1935, working with Walt Disney, Lionel introduced a handcar with Mickey Mouse at one end and Minnie Mouse at the controls at the other. These sold for $1 a piece. They were also popular, and Cowan thought the idea that a mouse had saved the lion was a brilliant one, and so even though it wasn't true, he promoted it actively in the newspapers.
Until 1937, all locomotives and cars had been tin and painted for detail. But in 1937, a breakthrough, the Hudson. For the first time, Lionel was able to economically mass-produce a completely die-cast locomotive with scale model accuracy. This brand-new, state-of-the-art set sold for $75, which would equal about $1,200 in today's prices. In 1937, the Lionel Train Corporation went public, issuing 77,500 shares and raising almost $1 million.
In the late 30s, Lionel began to move away from the color and the whimsy that had distinguished its earlier trains and come up with more realistic and detailed models. Standard gauge was abandoned, and there was no question about the direction that Lionel was moving with very realistic models of top-of-the-line locomotives and rolling stock seen around the country. No question about the direction that they were moving by the time World War II erupted in the United States in 1941 and the following spring in 1942 when federal restrictions prohibited the production of electric trains.
In June 1942, production was stopped by World War II. Lionel helped the Navy with navigational products. When the war ended, Lionel trains had a decade of unprecedented success. Baby boomer children all wanted a toy train for Christmas, and Lionel's creative wheels were really turning.
Lionel's engineering department was coming up with more and more innovations, from the whistle and the remote control for accessories and operating cars that they developed in the late 1930s. And after the war, you've got smoke, you've got radio wave transmitters on trains, and you've got realistic knuckle couplers. Every year the trains are looking better, the line is growing larger. It's a very exciting time for Lionel.
After the war, the company continued churning out trains and accessories that were must-haves for kids and adults.
After the war, realism is still paramount at Lionel, but it's tempered by a sense of fancifulness, a sense of whimsy. The great example of this is the operating milk car, which children flock to by the thousands, and they want that. Also, there are bright and new colorful paint schemes on the new diesels, the F3 diesel that they introduced. So this is another great moment in the country, in Lionel's history. What makes this happen will be innovations in paint masking, in injection molding of plastics, in powder metallurgy. Just so Lionel is taking advantage of the latest innovations in technology and developing them and adapting them to their electric trains.
1953 was a peak year in sales, but in 1958, Lionel had its first losing year since the Depression. Interest faded and Lionel turned to airplanes, race cars, fishing rods and reels, trying to diversify. In 1957, Lionel created the Lady Lionel train in, quote, fashion colors of pink and lilac. Although highly collectible now, it was a huge flop. In 1959, with the business in decline, Joshua Cohen sold his company to his great-nephew, Roy Cohn. For the next 4 decades, the Lionel name bounced from owner to owner and managed to survive. Through the years, new models and fresh interest have turned the company around. As we head into a new century, Lionel trains are going strong. Joshua Cohen died at the age of 88 in Palm Beach, Florida. He would no doubt be thrilled to see his trains are still beloved around the world. He was an American success story, an innovator who created a display item and turned it into one of the most recognizable toys of the 20th century. But the man and the company did more. They created something that made a boy feel like a man and a man feel like a boy again. This is the Columbia River Steel Corporation. It's along a stretch of the Milwaukee Road main line. The creation of Jeff Bourne, it's a big HO layout that features heavy industry.
The purpose of this railroad is to move tonnage, because both of these plants consume a lot of carloads per day.
At 24 by 29 feet, it's a lot of layout. The mill line is over 1 scale mile long. The centerpiece of the layout, just as in a true steel mill, is the blast furnace.
At the blast furnace, we bring in iron ore, limestone, and coke, and converting it to iron, which is essentially steel with too much carbon in it.
Jeff built a lot of it from scratch after he spent a lot of time looking at the real places shown here in miniature.
Well, the first thing you got to do is see the prototype, and that's indispensable. You got to go to a mill to get a feel. And I've been to at least through 6 steel mills.
It's the building that's magic for Jeff Bourne, not running the trains. Knowing that things like this blast furnace were brought to life with his hands.
Research is part of it. Getting the stuff to, understanding the processes, what each piece of equipment does, and actually building it. It's a lot of fun to build. It's a creative process.
22 cars of limestone, 25 cars of coke, and a whopping 92 cars of iron ore pound through every 24 hours. The raw materials you're looking at are the real thing. Jeff uses actual coke, iron ore, and limestone. After all, if you want it to look authentic, real is real.
The iron ore I got up in Hibbing from the old Hull Rust mine. Limestone I got a guy out in Ohio. Coke I picked up off the tracks and crushed up in Duluth. That's pretty much the raw materials.
This isn't a place to admire the trees or pretend you're in a picturesque small town. Jeff has designed and built a tough, hard-working piece of America.
Most people, they got their mountains, you know. My heavy industry is, they're my mountains and valleys. So that's kind of how I've told people why I do this. It's different. You know, everybody's got mountains and rivers and logging and all that. I'm not interested in that.
Like all layouts, this one isn't finished. Whatever the future holds for the Columbia River Steel Corporation, you just know it's going to be mostly involving hard work and heavy equipment.
There are a few tips that will come in handy when working with resin, particularly cleaning off the flash from the parts. Flash is the little bit of extra resin that's dangling down in the joint here, and it's filling in the windows here and here. Now you can use a hobby knife, files, or sanding sticks to clean the flash out of the parts. I'll just use this hobby knife to get in and clean off the flash out of this corner here. You just work the knife in there carefully, and you just back drag along the edge and keep working it along until you get it cleaned out. And then you can go in and do fine touch-up work with files or the sanding sticks, but you can use the hobby knife to get the bulk of the flash out. Now the next thing when working with resin is the type of glue you use. Unlike plastic, where you can use a variety of liquid plastic cements, you have basically 2 options with resin. You can either use cyanoacrylate adhesive, or CA, or super glue, or you can use a 5-minute epoxy. The epoxies are found in most hobby shops, and particularly in hobby shops that carry remote control airplanes. I'm going to use CA to work on this mobile home kit here. So what I'll do is I'll just take a little bit of CA, put it on a piece of paper, then I'll take one of these micro brushes here, and I'll just get a little bead, and we'll work the CA along this edge here till we get it nice and filled up, a nice bead of it along in there. Then what I'll do is I'll take the part, and then we'll put it into this joint like that. You have a few seconds of working time with CA, so you have to be fast with this. Then let's take this machinist square and make sure that the part is at a right angle. And once the piece is at a right angle, I'll take this little chunk of styrene here, and I'm just going to set it in the joint until it's up against the piece. And then with the styrene strip in place, I'll run an extra bead of CA along this joint to reinforce it. And the main purpose for adding that extra styrene strip is just to give the wall section a little more rigidity, particularly as you work on the later parts of the kit. There will be times where the joints won't fit up very well, and you'll need to go in and fill the joints. The product I like to use for that is flex paste. It's just a white paste material. And I take an applicator here, a little putty applicator, and I'll just take a little load of it here. And then I'll go along, there's a little gap in here, and I'll just lightly fill in that seam. And then I can take the other end here, which is a little finer, and then we'll just go along the seam like that, wipe off the excess up there. Flex paste requires 3 applications to dry hard and to make it sandable. Once the resin kit is completely assembled, you want to wash it one more time with the warm soapy water just to make sure that any residues such as skin oils, dust, or any other particles that may affect paint adhesion are removed. And then you can go ahead and prime the model to ensure that the paint has an even coverage. I like to use an automobile primer, and then after the primer's been given 24 hours to dry, you can go ahead and paint it with your favorite model paints. And I have an example of a painted resin kit right here. As you can see, I painted it the two-tone brown scheme, and then I added the aluminum trim around the window detail. One thing that's important when you're working with a painted kit, though, is that you want to get any paint off of the mating surfaces. And you can do this with a sanding stick or with a hobby knife. I'll use a hobby knife and just back drag along this edge. And as you can see, it's already lifting the paint, and then we're getting down to the primer layer. And now we're starting to see the white. And when you see the white, that's good, because that's the bare resin. And then we'll just keep working along the 3 edges like that, and then we'll make sure that the roof is largely free of paint, and then you can go in with the cyanoacrylate adhesive and glue the roof on and let that set. To make sure the roof piece holds on, just add a few rubber bands around the top, and that'll hold it in place. Give the CA a few minutes to dry, and you'll be all set. One other thing to remember when painting resin parts is that you want to make sure the paint is given ample time to dry. This little stair detail with the mobile home kit was painted, and then I masked it about an hour later. And as you can see, I didn't give it enough time to dry. And the paint lifted off. While it looks neat and you could say it's a weathered detail, it looks kind of rough, and I will have to go back and touch this up either with a brush or scuff the part up and repaint it. As you can see, resin kits are very easy to build once you get the hang of it. I recommend starting small with a basic kit such as a mobile home or an easy to build vehicle, and then moving on to something more complex like a freight car. As you gain confidence, you'll be ready to tackle more and more of these kits, and you can add a lot of resin models to your layout.
For years, it was such a common sight, the caboose, the last car on a freight train. It was a home away from home for the crew. It was a rolling lookout post so the conductor could keep an eye on the freight cars. In its peak, during the 1920s, the number of cabooses pulling up the rear was more than 25,000.
There's basically 3 types of cabooses. The most popular and the most famous kind is the good old-fashioned cupola caboose, which had a cupola, or almost like an observation tower, on the top of the caboose. Another basic kind you saw on mainline railroads was the bay window caboose, where instead of being perched atop the caboose, the crew would look down the side of the train from a bay window that stuck out the side of the caboose. And finally, the other basic type was called a transfer caboose, which was used in switching. It had a small little boxy room on top of a flat car, basically, with a large porch on both sides of the car so that the crew could have lots of visibility as a train went switching around in terminal trackage around cities and industrial sites.
They were bare bones, but functional. The conductor made this his office, desk and all. The brakeman could use this as his home base if he wasn't scrambling across the tops of boxcars to set the handbrakes. The crewman would watch over the train from the cupola for overheated axle bearings or hot boxes. But when technology came rumbling down the tracks, no one could stop it.
I think there were basically three factors that did in the caboose. One was simply the cost. The railroads were determined to try to remove the cost of operating cabooses because, quite simply, it cost them money to buy a caboose, own it, maintain it, insure it, and then haul it around on the end of a train. Another big thing that helped them get rid of the caboose was the drive towards smaller crews. As railroads found that they could get down to originally 4, 3, and then 2-man crews, there was no need for the caboose. You had such a small crew, it would easily fit into the cab of the locomotive and you wouldn't have to have a caboose to carry them around in. And the final thing, and this is what really did them in at the very end, was just the high technology that came along. The main thing was the end-of-train device, or the flashing rear end device, also known as a FRED, which is a small telemetry device that fits on the rear coupler at the end of a freight train and sends signals to the crew in the locomotive, keeping them up to date on air brake pressure and things like that. But there were also devices along the railroad track itself that would help the railroad do much of the work that the crew used to do on the caboose. Mainly things like dragging equipment detectors or hotbox detectors. The addition of that sort of technology really made the caboose obsolete, at least in the eyes of railroad management.
So beginning in the 1970s, the caboose was removed from service. Gone, but certainly not forgotten, thanks to collectors like those here at the Mid-Continent Railroad Museum in Wisconsin.
Well, I used to work for the railroad as a conductor years ago for the Chicago Northwestern, and it kind of gets in your blood. The reason I really like the caboose is it's small, it's quaint, and it's quite unique. And after spending so many hours and so many miles in a caboose, when this one became available for sale, it was just a real joy being able to purchase the caboose and restore it to its present condition.
Jeff Hartline fixed up his so nicely that it truly is a museum piece.
The history of this caboose dates to 1925 when it was built for the Great Northern by their car shops in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I picked a caboose to restore because originally I was from Milwaukee, and like many of our members, we needed a place to stay. So a caboose was the most natural thing to purchase and bring here on the property and restore it and live in it when I came up here to donate my time to Mid-Continent Railway.
If you look closely, you can tell that every caboose once had a life, where the smell of coal and kerosene mixed with the aroma of beans and beef stew. It was the Pullman car for the train crew. It was the end of the train and the end of an era.
Model railroad manufacturers offer locomotives and freight cars in a variety of paint schemes, but there may be instances where you'd like to decorate your rolling stock for your own railroad. In those instances, you can look for undecorated models, but if those are unavailable, the next step is to strip the paint from a factory painted model. A technique I like to use is 91% isopropyl rubbing alcohol. Don't get this confused with the 70% alcohol sold in stores. The 91% is far more effective at stripping the paint, and it does so in a much quicker fashion. I'll take this model here. It's just a factory painted GP9, and I'll set it in the tub, and then I'll just take the alcohol and dump it in here. Just do it real easy like. There are also alternatives to isopropyl alcohol. Some paint strippers you can use just like the alcohol, where you put the model into a tray and then you immerse it in the solution. There are also brush-on paint strippers, where you just brush a little bit onto the side of the model and let the paint start to dissolve. You do not immerse the entire model when you use the brush-on paint stripper. It's been about 30 minutes and we're ready to start stripping paint off the locomotive. As with any project like this, you want to be sure to take proper safety precautions. Have a well-ventilated area, wear an apron, gloves, and eye protection. Now we'll go ahead, start with a toothbrush here. An old toothbrush works great to strip off most of the paint. And we'll just go in here and we'll get the model and we'll just start removing the paint like this. The process goes very easily. As you can see, it's just lifting the paint right off the sides. And no problem at all. And just go like that. And for the fine areas of the model, you can use these little micro brushes to get into any small areas such as the door latches where the paint tends to really want to stick in there more, and you can just see how the micro brush takes the paint right out of there. And here's a model that's been completely stripped of paint. And as you can see, I've gone along and made sure all the paint is out of any of the grooves and in the door latches. If any paint's left in those areas, it'll clump up and can affect the paint job and make the model not look as nice. You just want to go along all the details, get the roof line, all the louvers along the sides here. That's a lot of the trouble spots where the paint tends to want to stick. And here's a sample of a locomotive that was stripped and repainted by model railroaders editor Terry Thompson. As you can see with the repaint, the decaling, and the weathering, this model looks prototypical and ready to go into service on the layout. There are a variety of paint strippers out there, but the results are all the same. And they'll yield a clean model that's ready to repaint and decal and put into service on your layout.
The Baltimore Society of Model Engineers is the second oldest club of model railroad enthusiasts in the nation. Since 1932, people who love model railroading have gathered here in Baltimore to share their love of model railroading and to do their part to preserve the history of railroading. Everywhere you look here, you find museum pieces and impressive artifacts collected by club members during the past 70 years.
One of the members of the club had ties to the Baltimore and Ohio Public Relations Department. I don't know whether he worked there, but in any case he had some ties. And he contacted his counterpart in the PR departments at a number of the other railroads and asked them to send to him an example of their railroad herald that they would put on their freight cars or box cars, for example, on a 4x4 sheet of material, plywood or whatever. And what we ended up with is a collection of 32 authentic railroad heralds mounted on a 4x4 board. So as you go around and look at the different heralds, you'll see that there's different shades of kind of a reddish-brown color. And we all think of that as boxcar red, and if you buy a bottle of modeling paint, you just buy boxcar red. Well, each railroad had its idea about what boxcar red was, and here you can get an idea of what they actually thought it was. I don't think you're going to find a collection like this anywhere else in the country. We have the number plate and the builder's plate and a whistle off of a Pennsylvania K4, along with photographs of that locomotive when it was in service.
The historical artifacts aren't the only things that give this place flavor. Take a look at the reason the club organized in the first place. O-gauge. There's a giant O-gauge layout that wows visitors the minute they walk in the door. 13 feet wide by 70 feet long, the Allegheny Northern rolls through the gentle foothills of the Mid-Atlantic Piedmont region. It's a layout that's frozen in time during the 1950s, when steam was giving way to diesel. Extraordinary locomotives and rolling stock. Realistic scenery and structures. The main line runs from Baltimore to Johnstown, with a few stops in between. It pays homage to a different era, the 1950s, which also happens to be the time Carrie Davis joined the club.
I've always been fascinated by trains. My earliest memory was standing on a bridge watching the B&O Railroad switch cars around in the 30s. And I was always a Lionel toy train buff. When I found out about the Model Railroad Club here, the BSME, through the Lionel Model Builders magazine back in the 30s, I got on a streetcar, went over to 1613 North Chester Street, where the club was located, and here was this world of O-scale trains, which I had never seen before. I didn't think anything was available but Lionel, except special built scale models. And when I found out it was a hobby that anyone could get into, I've been here ever since. Many visitors are fascinated by the operation of the turntable how the engines go on the turntable or turned around and backed into the engine house, switching the engines around from one track to another. There's always a congregation of people right here during our open house shows. I also like to point out this freight house behind me, built by a man who cannot see. He can't see a thing, and yet he builds structures that are just magnificent.
Not only are the cars and scenery realistic, take a look at the track itself. It's Code 172 steel rail hand-laid track work. The track work itself is antique and looks much like real steel rail. There's a trolley and an interurban that rolls between the two major cities as well, providing passenger service that the primarily coal-hauling main line is not always able to provide. It's a complicated old layout, which can be difficult to maintain.
It is difficult to maintain in the sense that a lot of us that are members of the club now were not members of the club when parts of this layout were built. And for example, chasing down an electrical problem, we don't always know where to begin or what color wire goes to what. So we might be able to find a wire that works a particular switch machine or switch, but knowing where that wire is fed from gets to be a real challenge, and we end up having to trace back through some things. And it seems like we're reinventing the wheel every time we try to chase down a problem like that.
As if all this wasn't enough to keep club members busy, they also have a wonderful and equally large HO layout that was originally added to attract more members. Because HO was a smaller and less expensive end of the hobby back in the 1940s when this was added, it was hoped that adding such a layout would broaden the appeal of the club. It worked, and now the HO layout has taken on a life of its own.
The coal mine in the middle of the railroad, I think, is very special. The locomotive facilities, they are dual service facilities for both diesel and steam engine.
The Baltimore Society of Model Engineers, hundreds and hundreds of members over the past 7 decades who have contributed thousands of hours and an immeasurable amount of love and dedication, so that generation after generation of model railroading fans here have a place to call home.
We've reached the end of the line for this edition. We hope you've enjoyed the ride. We'll have more layouts, prototypes, and how-to tips next time, and more fun with the world's greatest hobby in the Dream, Plan, Build video series. Welcome to the Dream, Plan, Build video series. In this collection, you'll see amazing layouts of fellow modelers, some of the most interesting trains and railroads around, and plenty of tips and techniques to make your time at the workbench and at the throttle more productive and a lot more fun. We'll travel across America in search of layouts we all dream of operating and get inside the heads of their builders as they describe how they designed and built their prized railroads. Plus, whether you're running a 4x8 or a 40x80 operation, you'll discover tips and techniques to make your rolling stock run smoother and look more realistic.